Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, good evening. This is Stephen Lewis, and Stephen Frampton, my friend, is here with me. Hey, Steve, how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you, Stephen. Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great as well. Today, we have a very solemn edition of Metaphysical Media. We are going to talk about the perpetrator of the Isla Vista, California tragedy. And I want to go ahead and apologize in advance because for some reason I keep calling this guy Elliot Gould. Elliot Gould is a fine actor. His name is Elliot Roger, who I'm talking about. So if I accidentally call him Elliot Gould, please forgive me in advance. We're going to be talking about Elliot Roger today, Steve. On the Metaphysical Media Group fan page on Facebook, if you go to the study albums, the photo albums there, you'll see the Buried Above the Ground photo album. And in that photo album, you'll be able to find all the different charts that we're going to consider. And the most important illustrations in that photo album are perhaps figures 16 and 17. These show the Fiodaria tables. And Steve, really something special about the planetary periods known as the Fiodaria is that if we match the events of his life to the proper Fiodaria table, then we can go ahead and eliminate 12 hours out of the day from Elliot Roger's birth time. You know, no astrologer has his precise birth time. And so we are going to be able to really ballpark that birth time a lot better and get some astrological insight into Elliot Roger. Now, for reasons that will become clear throughout the rest of this broadcast, I prefer figure 16, which shows a day birth sequence of planets. I mean, one thing about the Fiodaria is that the sequence of planetary rulers is different depending upon whether you were born during the day or during the night. And based upon the events of Elliot Roger's life, I'm judging this guy to have been born with the sun above the horizon, Steve, because his life really started out brilliantly. He loved his life when he was a child. So this really conforms to the idea that he started out with the Fiodaria of the sun, a 10-year-long period, and life was pretty good for him then. He had an idyllic experience growing up in England. He was spoiled thoroughly by his parents. So when he was that age, his idea that he was someone special and magnificent was thoroughly validated by those in his environment, Steve.
Yeah, strange guy, very strange guy. I'm using the birth time that you recommended, Stephen, 6:19 a.m. We know from the media that he was born in the morning. We don't know exactly what time, but I'm going with 6:19 a.m. And I think it's very interesting to look at a person's psyche when you don't know the exact time, because we can really consider many different possibilities. And for our listeners, they need to know anyway that the birth time doesn't change the positioning of the planets or under the signs of the zodiac or the degrees that they might be under, and it doesn't change the aspects between the planets. It would just change the phasing of the houses and therefore the ascendant, descendant, IC and MC, those 4 power points in the chart. So we've still got a lot we can work with.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. Also, if you go to that if you go to that photo album for this show and you scroll through all the different charts there, all the different hypothetical birth charts for Elliot Roger, you'll see the planetary positions do not change. If you look at the aspectarian, the aspect grid to the left of the image, you'll see that the aspects remain the same. So the only item in question is, where are the houses at? Where do the houses lie? So the Fiodaria help us to eliminate 12 hours automatically. Okay, so the sun's above the horizon. Now, we know from Elliot's own words, for whatever that's worth, that he was born, quote unquote, in the morning. So the sun's above the horizon. That eliminates 12 midnight right on up till sunrise. So what we're left with is the period from around 6 o'clock or so in the morning right up to 11:59. So the chart that I'm actually inclined to use right now is a figure 7. And I suspect that this guy has either a Cancer ascendant or a Leo ascendant. But one thing I definitely want the sun to be cadent here, because I'm convinced Elliot Roger has a cadent sun, meaning it's in the 6th house or the 12th house, and probably not the 3rd and the 9th, because of the 4 cadent houses, the 3rd and the 9th are the most positive. I'm looking for a 12th house sun here, Steve, or a sixth house sun. And also, we're going to use astrological physiognomy to sort of get in the ballpark with this birth figure. And, Elliot Roger was a little guy. He was just a whittle fella. You know what I mean? And the ancient authorities, Bonatti in particular, tell us that if you have a stellium of planets in the 6th or the 12th houses, this can incline one to dwarfism. Now, with a Leo ascendant, Leo is a tall sign. It produces rather tall natives. So if you have, I'm figuring if we have that stellium of planets, Moon, Uranus, Neptune, in the 6th house, plus a tall rising sign like Leo, then we can, produce a native who's not a dwarf, but who's just a, what's the word I'm looking for? A shrimp.
Shrimp. Shorty.
Shorty.
Yeah. I think people don't generally realize that astrology even accounts for a person's physical appearance. In other words, if a person knows astrology well enough, if they understand the physical characteristics of different signs, different planets, and the houses, etc., then they could, in theory, look at a person and understand quite a lot of their astrological profile, therefore understand that person's psyche to quite a significant degree.
Absolutely. It's not. I mean, it has application also in judging what type of work is going to be appropriate for someone. For example, if you see, from the chart that the physiognomy of a certain native does not conduce to manual labor, then it would be foolish to prognosticate these things for that native. And so, all the planets, every planet will try to impress its influence upon the flesh of the native. So I suspect that Elliot Roger's ascendant is probably going to be in the late degrees of Cancer, which would progress it to the earlier degrees of Leo, fairly quickly. Now, so early years of Elliot Roger, not so bad. Of course, looking through his autobiography, you become aware that his egocentrism started obviously very young. His parents spoiled him thoroughly. His stepmother was the only person I could see who actually tried to exert some kind of discipline on this little shit stain, and he hated her for it. He absolutely despised her for that. Everybody else, they gave in to his every whim. He learned very early on, especially the mother. His mother spoiled him to a disgusting degree. Everything that he wanted, he got. And if he didn't get, he figured out the best way to do it was just to throw a tantrum. We're talking about a man here who would weep heavily over the slightest provocation well into his 20s, right up until the day that he died. In fact, there's this one especially provocative story in his autobiography where he listens to this African-American kid brag about his sexual exploits, and this is the sort of behavior that Elliot Roger hated more than anything. And it upset. He hated this. He got so upset at this black kid for doing that he ran to his room. This is a college kid, and in living with roommates. He ran to his room and started crying, much to the delight of his roommates. You see, so this is the sort of personality we're dealing with here.
Yeah, you could. When I watched his video on YouTube, and he was saying that he'd never slept with a girl. He was annoyed, angry that he'd never had any sexual experiences. But he wasn't an unattractive guy. He was an attractive guy, but it was pretty clear that his character just was dreadful, and I should think that would be a huge turn-off for people. I don't think it was about his appearance, but he was obviously a very, very strange person. And, when I look at his chart, Stephen, one of the things that sticks out to me is the fact that his sun is at 0 degrees Leo. Right. But it's 0 degrees Leo. It's right at the beginning of that fixed sun sign. Yeah. And that fascinated me because it's opposed by Saturn, and an opposition between the Sun and the Saturn, when it's pretty close like that, it can be challenging. It certainly can be challenging. But what's particularly interesting with Elliot is when you look at the declinations when he was born. In other words, when we look at the positioning of the planets above and below the equator, we see that the Sun and Saturn were contraparallel. In other words, they were at the same degree, one on one side of the equator, the other on the other side of the equator, and astrologically or psychologically that intensifies a connection between the two planets. So he's got this struggling opposition between the Sun and Saturn, but it's amplified massively by the fact that they were contra-parallel in relation to the equator. That's the thing that stood out to me first of all. But then I noticed that the asteroid Chiron, which can be problematic, was conjunct his Sun when he was born, and it wasn't even 1 degree away. It was 33 minutes away. Yeah. So there's a very strong dynamic just there.
Yeah, and we're talking about a Sun here that is essentially feral. Now, feral in the context of astrology, it means something very specific. It means an unaspected planet, a planet that receives no aspect. The Sun has only one major Ptolemaic aspect to a major planet, that's Saturn. It's relatively, in fact, it's unaspected by everything else. There is a minor, very minor separating aspect with the Moon, but it does not count. So this is a huge contributing factor to Elliot's peculiarly offensive brand of egotism. I'll tell you, Steve, when you first shared his videos with me, I did not believe him in one bit. I was like, this kid isn't going to do anything. This was before I found out about the massacre. I was like, this kid isn't going to do anything. He's just shooting off at the mouth. I couldn't believe that such outrageous self-love existed, even in a compensating form, like, I've been picked on, so I'm magnificent. It went even beyond that. I'm like, this guy can't possibly believe he's such a gift to humanity. But with this unaspected Sun in the very beginning degrees of Leo, absolutely he believes.
And as you said, unaspected, there is not a good aspect to his Sun. The only aspect is that conjunction to Chiron, Yuck, and the pretty tight opposition to the major malefic Saturn and Uranus, the earlier degrees of Uranus as well, another fixed sign.
Yep.
So his Sun, his power center, his essence, his ego is yuck.
It's uninfluenced by any other astrological factor in the chart. It is uninfluenced. Now, this opposition with Saturn is applying, which means that it's getting tighter and more exact when he was born. So this is going to represent Saturn problems. This is going to represent these things throughout life. Now, one reason I like a late Cancerian or an early Leo type of ascendant is because of the 7th house of relationship. This would put that in Aquarius or Capricorn. I'm convinced that one of Saturn's signs is on the descendant based upon the way Elliot Roger, not Elliot Gould, but Elliot Roger, based upon the way that he tried to relate to people, with fear, with an incredible awareness of the status quo, an over-awareness of hierarchy. That's what I'm trying to say. This guy was very much aware of the social hierarchy, of all kinds of hierarchies, and it was important to him to fit very highly on that hierarchy. And when he realized that he couldn't do it based upon his own natural characteristics, he decided that the only way to do it was to become rich. He would buy the women that he wanted, not prostitutes, but he would attract them, a wife, a beautiful blonde wife to him through his money. And the ironic thing is looking at the Fiodoria tables, had he survived, he would have been able to have done this once he reached 25, 30, or something like that. He would have been able to have attracted the wife that he wanted, but she would have brought him no pleasure. Elliot Roger was doomed to meet the fate that he met, because looking at his planetary Fiodoria sequence, it was going to get a hell of a lot worse before it ever got better. And he knew it. That's one of the reasons why he did his despicable act. He felt, he knew things were going to just get terrible for him. And he was quite right. If he had managed to have survived the Mercury planetary period, which he didn't, then he would have been faced with the planetary periods of the Moon and Saturn after that. And we're talking about a 20-year period of hell. That would have been a terrible, would have been a lot worse. Now,
well, Stephen, I think that something extremely significant about this chap is when you look at the signs that are prominent in this chart. So he's got his Sun in Leo, his Jupiter in Leo, his Mercury in Leo, and he's got the asteroid Chiron there. And then you look at Capricorn. He's completely polarized. He's got all of this going on in Leo and all of this going on in Capricorn because he's got the Moon, Uranus, Neptune, North Node in Capricorn, and then Saturn only at 3 degrees of Aquarius, not far from Capricorn. So he's really sort of torn between two archetypes. Although he's got his Venus and Mars in Virgo, which I think is another problem. But you see, when you say to yourself, well, he's got all of this energy in Leo, and Leo is ruled by the Sun, and his Sun is pretty crap. To be quite honest, astrologically, I know it's a complex term, but it's one we use in astrology, isn't it? It's crap. His Sun's crap. Yep. And then you say, well, and there's all that going on in Capricorn. The ruler of Capricorn is the major malefic itself, Saturn, and you look at the aspects to Saturn in his chart. Saturn opposes the Sun and Chiron. So the vast majority of the energy in his chart is ruled or mastered by these two horribly aspected, almost empty, void, soulless planets in his charts. And I think that's extremely significant as well.
Yeah, it is.
Especially, Stephen, if he was born around the time we think, and his ascendant, his personality, and his almost his relationship with himself or view of himself, if that's also in Leo, ruled by his shitty Sun, then even greater polarization, even greater problem for him.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at his moon, this is going to provide a wonderful snapshot image, not only of his experience of mother, but also the sort of wife he would have managed to attract. So we have the moon in Capricorn. Now, that moon is in the bounds of Venus. In other words, Venus has a minor dignity in Capricorn for the first 5 or 6 degrees, and his moon is at 3 degrees of Capricorn. Now, what this means in terms of delineation is that we can actually interpret this very much like a Moon-Venus conjunction in Capricorn. So he would have gotten a wife who was very materialistic, just like his mom. Now, another thing, too, there's a deeper division of the circle. You know, most modern astrologers only use 2 levels of dignity in evaluating planets. That's the dignity of rulership and the dignity of exaltation. But I use, in traditional astrology, we use a 7 levels of planetary dignity, just like the Vedic astrologers. So there are two different levels I'd like to introduce to people. What the Hindus would call the Navamsas, and also the Dwads, the Dwadeshamsas. And the Dwadeshamsas are actually referred to in traditional literature as the duodecimi. The duodecimi signorum. So what these are is essentially a miniature zodiac. It's a fractal relationship where there's a miniature zodiac inside of each sign. Okay, and at 3 degrees of Capricorn, the moon is actually inside the Dwad of Capricorn. So this is an extreme emphasis on materiality and on the advancement of materiality. And indeed, Elliot Roger would have gotten exactly what he wanted. He would have gotten his moon in Capricorn wife, and then he would have hated it. He would have been twice as unhappy as he was when he was a kid.
Well, Stephen, when I first watched the video clip of him sitting in his car, before he started to get into his spiel,
right,
I looked at it and thought, okay, there's a young gay guy sitting in his car about to say something, and he went on and on and on, and I wonder if part of the problem was actually his confusion about sexuality that he maybe didn't want to express, and I think that when you look at his chart and you see Mars conjunct Venus there in Virgo, trining both Mars and Venus trining Uranus. Yeah. The jury's out. I'm not sure he was straight.
I'm not either, and I base that evidence not only on astrological testimony, but also on his own manifesto, his own autobiography. If you read that thing, you'll see he devotes most of his time to males. Even though on the video, he's all like, "I can't get laid, and it's your fault for not giving me any tail, and I hate you all." In his autobiography, he's talking about specific males all the time, and one gets the impression that his hatred, his misogyny, his hatred of women is actually jealousy, because he could not make any progress with these males. Now, interestingly enough, the traditional literature, Bonatti, says that looking at the Navamsa of the moon, looking at the Nova Nerea Signorum of the moon, will give you an idea of a native's tastes, what turns the native on. And his moon is actually in the Navamsa of Saturn. So that's the sort of thing that turned him on.
And it's conjunct Uranus, and let's face it, we know that Uranus is quirky. So if it's correct that the moon does have an influence over sexual taste, conjunct Uranus, it would suggest that his taste would have been different. Not that there's anything wrong with being bisexual or gay or
of course not,
whatever, but that's just something that struck me when I started to watch his video.
Well, he's a little priss pot. I mean, I'm happily hetero, and I probably would do him. You know what I mean? He looks like a female. I mean, he's delicate. He lacks any masculine qualities at all, and I really think I really think that the problem with this guy is if reading the autobiography, you'll see that school was the crucible in which his social development unfolded. And for the life of me, I do not understand why his parents did not see the red flags here. Okay, as soon as he started school, the conflict started getting progressively worse. By the time he gets to middle school, okay, he's in the Venus Feardaria. And again, we talked about Venus being in Virgo. Okay, he enters the Venus Feardar, the Venus planetary period, that summer when he turns 11. Okay, when the Mercury sub-period starts, and again, I'm referring to figure 16, I want to say, for those who would like to follow along. By the time the Mercury Feardar starts, the sub-period starts, he's actually starting middle school. Fine, no problem. But you'll notice his experience with school gets worse and worse. Before he goes into middle school, he knows he's going to hate it. It's going to be terrible. By the time he goes into high school, he's petrified before he starts high school. He begs his father to sign him up at Crespi Carmelite High, an all-boys school. Okay, but we're jumping ahead of ourselves here. I want to talk about his middle school years a little bit first. He has his first sexual experience at 11. Okay, he's chatting with a friend on AOL Instant Messenger. The friend sends him some pictures of naked women. Quite tellingly, Elliot Roger stops talking to that person after that. He's disgusted. He's horrified. And he knows that it's not going to turn well he knows it's not going to turn out well for him. Now, Mercury, he's in the Mercury sub-period of Venus, and Mercury is going to represent death for him. It's during this time that his best friend's mother, Venus, passes away from a long bout with breast cancer. So Mercury is locally determined towards death somehow. This is my theory. Now, in this Venus Feardar, Venus being a natural significator for women, young Elliot is scarred for life. He goes to summer camp in Pinecrest, where he gets his ass handed to him by a girl. This humiliates him in front of everyone. Okay? And from this point forward, the happy period described by the son, and he'll be the first to tell you, he makes constant reference to it throughout his autobiography. When I was a kid, life was fair. There was an even playing field. Of course, his idea of this was no doubt comes from the fact that his dad had money and that he was affluent. I'm sure that, if he grew up in the Bronx, or some terrible neighborhood in Compton or whatever, he wouldn't see life that way. But in the period of the sun, life was very fair. But this insulating influence is all off once he gets into Venus. Once he gets into the Venus period, things start going downhill from there. His father starts having financial problems. His parents are divorced. He hates that. Now, it's very interesting. When he reaches the age of 13, he subtitles this period in his autobiography, "Stuck in the Void." Now, this surprised me because we named this show Buried Above the Ground. I wanted to capture the idea that here's a guy walking around and he might as well be in a coffin. He's interred. He can't be seen. I mean, this is why I think he's got a cadence. So he actually saved his little brother's life from drowning in a pool and nobody noticed. That's how invisible this kid was. And so this phraseology, that he used, stuck in the void, makes me think that he would have agreed with the name for this show 100%. And I didn't realize that, I named the show before I read this autobiography.
You know what is sick about him, though? I think he'd be delighted by all of the media attention. He's just very, very bizarre. I wanted us to talk a little about his Mercury, Stephen, because that's the left hemisphere of the brain. So just for everybody's reference, Mercury rules the logical, rational, masculine left hemisphere of the brain, and the moon rules the impulsive, creative, intuitive right hemisphere of the brain. And when you analyze the power in the chart and you look at the power of Mercury, you say, oh, he's got a good, powerful Mercury. But then when you look at the aspects it forms to the other planets to get a greater understanding of how it functions, you see that there are some significant problems, because I find, Stephen, psychologically, the outer planets, the trans-Saturnian planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, to be of particular interest. My instinct has always said to me that Uranus, Pluto, Neptune have a big bearing over how we function psychologically, and particularly our unconscious processing. So you could say from a metaphysical or spiritual hermetic perspective that they somehow reflect how we're interacting with spirit, our own spirit, or the astral plane, etc. But when you look at Mercury in his chart, it forms challenging aspects to all of the outer planets, all of the trans-Saturnian planets. So his rational left brain is almost constantly disrupted by its negative or challenging connections or wiring to those planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So the kid was just seriously unbalanced. I know his mother contacted his father, I think, and said, Elliot's gone missing, something's horribly wrong, we've got to try and find him, and they wanted to find him. And also, obviously, his mother had seen the video he posted on YouTube, Stephen, right. But those aspects to Mercury and the trans-Saturnian planets say to me, seriously unstable mentally. There's just no doubt about it, and I look at his chart and think, well, even if he was okay earlier in life, this is a guy that would develop mental, psychological problems. Do you agree?
Totally.
There was pretty much no way out.
There was no way out for him because such was his mental pathology that he could not be in human society and see happy people, especially young couples. He could not tolerate that. Towards the end of all of this, it was getting so bad that he would assault them. He would drive up to them and throw coffee on them and then speed away, little son of a bitch. When you read things like that, you want to grab him by the throat and just crush the life out of him. I mean, he's really infuriating. He could not stand happy people, and he could not be in a context where others were happy. In the autobiography, okay, he has a brother. Yes.
Stephen, I it was interesting because the police didn't. I'm sure I know this has all happened very quickly, and this week's been a really, really busy week. Mm-hmm. But the police did assess him, didn't they, and say, we don't consider him to be a risk. Even with that video online, no risk. They did go to see a whole cadre of cops went by his apartment. His mother called them on him when she saw the video. She had an opportunity to discipline the boy her whole life, and when she failed, she appealed to the cops. They go by his apartment, and Elliot was horrified. He says in his autobiography, if they had searched my apartment, everything would have been finished. So I just told them, it's a big misunderstanding, sirs.
and they looked at this kid, and you look at him, and he's like, he couldn't harm his way out of a wet paper bag, which is an underestimation.
But do you not think, if you were a police officer, would you not say, you know what, let's not take the risk with this guy that's just posted this video saying that he wants to slaughter people? Why take the risk?
Yeah, well,
and this happens, Stephen, in these cases of mass murder. This happens. There are signs, and you look at for example, I know it's not a mass murder case, but Jeffrey Dahmer. We did a very interesting show on Jeffrey Dahmer. A serial killer is of a very different nature than a mass murderer. For everyone's reference, if you don't know, the difference is a mass murderer goes out and kills a bunch of people and then usually kills themselves, but it's a one-time offense. Serial killers doing it over and over and over. And Dahmer, for example, one of his victims escaped and was speaking with some women, asking for their help. They called the police, and the police helped Dahmer, and because Dahmer explained that he was dating the guy and that he'd had too much to drink, the police helped him get the kid back.
Yeah.
So you see some incredibly shocking judgments or poor judgments by members of the police force in these situations. This one's a shocker.
It is rather frustrating, and I'm sure those policemen themselves are frustrated. He came so close to being able to enter into that dude's apartment and put a stop to everything. But, the cops, I understand. When I saw the video, I'm like, yeah, and before I learned what happened, I just saw the video, and my immediate reaction was, this kid's just shooting off at the mouth. I didn't sense any threat from him. You know what I mean? I didn't sense any. Now, the truth, I guess it's a little bit too late to assign blame, but I have to say his parents dropped the ball on this big time, because he was giving them red flags throughout his entire life. He could not integrate into any kind of society. Once he started high school, okay, he came across his friends, they were talking about, they actually brought to life his worst fear. At that age, the boys are they're putting aside Pokemon and skateboards, which, Elliot had picked up trying to be cool. That's all he wanted was to be cool. He would do anything to be cool. If all the kids were eating doo-doo in the middle of the interstate, Elliot would have been right out there trying to copy him to have been cool. So he hated more than anything. Once these kids start saying, yeah, I had sex with my girlfriend and blase, that's what and so he tried to think, well, maybe they're lying. He hoped beyond hope that they were lying. But then this one kid produces an audio recording. This was so upsetting to Elliot that he left school immediately, called his mom, and wept in the car all day, wept to her. He did not step foot in that high school again. He got a month off from school while his parents figured out what to do with him, and he sat in his room and played World of Warcraft the whole time and recovered, as he put it. He recovered. The little snot. Spoiled. Now, far from being a red flag, his parents, they reacted to him in their customary fashion when he wept to them. They gave him what he wanted. They took him out of school. But here's the kicker. He went from the frying pan directly into the fire because they took him out of Crespi Carmelite High and put him into Taft, which was a public school with 5 times the students. This was poison to Elliot. He lasted at that school for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. After that time, he convinced his parents to set up some kooky quasi homeschool arrangement where and all of a sudden, next thing you know, this sophomore in high school somehow is only going to this, special school for 3 hours a day and spending the rest of his days playing World of Warcraft. His mother and his father, they tolerated that. They allowed it to happen. They allowed that situation to fester. And instead of really making an effort to get quality support, they sent him to counselors, but they got the precisely wrong kinds of counselors. The counselors that were provided to Elliot Roger were precisely those counselors who accidentally exacerbated the phobic centers inside of Elliot. Good-looking guys with girlfriends. Or, one of his counselors was even a female herself. This was precisely the wrong type of counselor that would have made any kind of leeway with Elliot. So his parents dropped the ball on that. Now, to be fair, his dad did some sort of documentary, Oh My God, which was a stupid career move on his part. Elliot never forgave him for that because all of a sudden funds became scarce for Elliot. Remember now, Elliot's only way to get what he wants, which is respect, is to be rich, to look rich. Now, this was all a facade. He was not as rich as he put himself off to be because his father was certainly not Steven Spielberg. Okay, his association with the Hunger Games was tenuous at best. He didn't direct the damn thing. He was some sort of technical director, a consultant perhaps. He directed commercials. That's how he made his money. He did this documentary, invested all of his funds into it, and basically put the family in a bad way. Elliot never forgave him for that. And now, worse, Elliot, throughout the autobiography, Elliot blames his mother for not marrying one of the rich men that she was dating. Why couldn't she sacrifice for me? If she truly loved me, she would do this for me. Why can't she? I don't understand. You know what I mean? This is how egotistical he was. So, his folks saw this coming for a very long time. They had ample reason to believe that their son was being vomited up by society, and they just let it happen.
There was a very interesting interview with a young guy at the university that knew him, right, and on a number of occasions tried to interact with him, tried to get him to socialize. And he was explaining that you could hardly get a word out of him. So you could talk and talk and talk with him and ask him questions and encourage him to interact. And once every few minutes he'd say 3 or 4 words, that he was very, very awkward socially. And that was interesting because, when you watch the video of him on YouTube, I think it's been taken down now. The guy did a little monologue for, 10, 15 minutes?
Oh, far from being taken down, it's now proliferated like weeds on a lawn.
I thought it was taken. I saw something saying YouTube had taken it down.
I watched it again last night, and all of his other ones as well. They put up a warning, this could be disturbing, the YouTube community, blase, blase. They put up a warning.
Yeah.
And it's really a shame that...
Oh, that's what it was, a warning. But, Stephen, what I'm finding really interesting is when you glance at the natal chart and you see the configuration of the planets. So, in his chart, you see all these planets clustered in Leo. All of these planets in this part of fortune, the North Node clustered in Capricorn. And then you see Pluto not halfway in between, but you see Pluto hanging around there a little earlier on. And that's interesting because when you look at that dynamic and you say, okay, let's see what we've got in this chart. We've got all this energy vested under Leo with a ruler, the Sun. And let's analyze the condition of the Sun. Ugh, horrible. And then we've got all of this going on in Capricorn, ruler Saturn. Let's look at the condition of his Saturn. Ouch. And then you see Pluto, 2 signs away from Capricorn,
right,
at 17 degrees Scorpio, and you think, that's a slow mover. But when he gets to his late teens, Pluto will have transited its way up gradually to that cluster in Capricorn, and it's going to pummel the hell out of that cluster. And in a chart that's as polarized as this, in such a troubled personality that just does not think right, it's a recipe for disaster. So you can almost glance at the natal chart without doing all of the other analyses beneath it, like the declinations and the parts of fortune, midpoints, right, asteroids, etc., and just say, oh, that Pluto's going to sweep up there. And this dynamic of Pluto moving its way up to the other outer planets at a certain point in life around the late teens, early 20s, is something that people of his generation have to deal with. But when you put it in the context of such a troubling overall chart, you just see it's a problem that's certain to raise its ugly head. And then I think that in all charts we really have to look at the moon and consider what's going to happen with the moon. So in his case, the moon was in Capricorn at 3 degrees and conjunct Uranus. So the moon, firstly, doesn't really belong in Capricorn. Capricorn's a cold sign, the moon doesn't do very well under Capricorn, generally speaking. It doesn't mean that everybody that's got their moon in Capricorn is insane by any means, but it's not where you would choose to position the moon if you were designing your own chart for a lifetime. But because the moon is conjunct Uranus, you get some strange impulses, strange sort of shifts in behaviors, reactions, unconscious reactions. And when you analyze the chart and say, well, where is the moon headed, you see that it's headed to an even more challenging dynamic in which it's going to be adversely affected as it progresses by these polarized planets. So I think that is another problem, because you could look at the natal chart and say, well, his impulses are only going to get more and more bizarre as he progresses through life, right, through his teenage years up to his 20s, and sure enough, this is what happened.
Yeah, I mean, the moon has it has very little, if any, dignity in Capricorn. Capricorn is opposed to the sign that the moon rules, and the moon generally doesn't do well in Capricorn. Now, you mentioned his fantasy life. We also have Neptune in Capricorn, retrograde, and this kid eventually, towards the end of the worst of his, towards the end there, he was fantasizing about rounding up. I mean, what the kid thought was a good society. Here's his idea of a good society, where all the women would be rounded up and put in a concentration camp, Capricorn, and starved to death. Okay? Starved to death. And in the concentration camp, he would have this huge tower. I mean, his Leonine nature is just all throughout this autobiography. He's going to have this huge tower that he gets to sit in and watch all of these girls starve to death. This was Elliot Roger's idea of a just society. You see, that's what he thought was a just society. And, he was destined to do something rash. Now, he didn't start thinking violent thoughts. He didn't start making he didn't start making his murderous career didn't start forming until he reached the sub-period of the sun during Venus's planetary period. During this time, and by now he's a teenager, during this time, he lays aside his World of Warcraft playing. Now, during the periods of the sun, you become what you are known for. The sun is all about your reputation, what it is that you do on this earth that you're going to be remembered for. And it's at this time that Elliot stops playing this video game that he's thoroughly addicted to, thoroughly addicted to world. He was living vicariously through his character on World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft essentially ended any kind of social life that he had, you see. So anyway, but again, the sun is what you are, what you're destined to become. So he stops playing the game. World of Warcraft stops to satisfy Elliot so much. It stops giving him a sense of emotional security. He gets depressed over this. He breaks down and starts crying in the middle of his gaming sessions, begins to play it less and less. From this time, however, I couldn't just stand by and accept such an injustice anymore. I refused to continue hiding away from the world and forgetting about all the insults it dealt to me. This is purely the sun coming through here. Now, he continues. This was the major turning point. My anger made me stronger inside. This was when I formed my ideas that sex should be outlawed. It's the only way to make the world a fair and just place. If I can't have it, I will destroy it. That's the conclusion I came to right then and there. Okay, so this is the sun talking. The sun's sub period. It brings Elliot away from the World of Warcraft, and now all of a sudden he's starting to form a plan to get noticed somehow. Do you see? Now the sun's also representing the father, and in this autobiography, Rodger is embarrassingly forthcoming about the financial follies of his father. Now, Mr. Rogers, I must say, Mr. Rodger, he tried to raise his son in a good way. I mean, he tried to make the little brat a gentleman, do you see? And it's natural to spoil your offspring, I suppose, to an extent. And I don't think Mr. Rodger spoiled Elliot anywhere near as badly as his mother did. Elliot was a mama's boy through and through. But Mr. Rodger suffers severe financial setbacks during the Venus-Sun period that has a significant effect on Elliot. And far from being the understanding and supportive son, Elliot says this in his autobiography. Right at the time when I needed my father's support the most, he lost all of his assets. It was as if some malevolent being cursed me with bad luck. I truly had no advantage at all. The universe was not kind to me. This is from page 57. But now he starts fantasizing about becoming a dictator. Even at the same time, he understands that he lacks the potency to rule over anything other than his masturbatory fantasies. Okay? But it's true to the nature of the sun ruling over this time. He changes his look from gamer slob to California cool. He creates a Facebook profile for the first time and instantly starts creating Facebook stalking accounts so that he can, not for the women, okay, not for women so much, he wants to see what the guys are doing. You see what I mean? How they're advancing in the social scale. One of his friends named Addison made the major mistake of evolving from a nerd into a Malibu cool kid. Elliot never forgave him for this. He plotted revenge for this. Even after they patched up their friendship, Elliot was like, okay, we can be friends again, but, I'm going to, he wrote this in his autobiography, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm going to get you eventually. He didn't tell Addison this because that sort of thing is not in Elliot's nature to actually say, I'm going to get in a fight with you. He was just like, I'm going to get you for this because according to Elliot, Addison's success made him seethe with rage. You see. Now at this point we're in the Mercury period of Elliot's life, and this is a period when it all comes to an end. Okay, looking at figure, I want to say it's figure 16. You can see the Mercury period. You can see the sequence of planets that will describe the events of his life. Okay, so we're in the Mercury period where the energies of Mercury, for whatever they mean for Elliot, are at their purest and at their strongest. Okay. Now, it's at this time that he discovers lottery tickets. He develops a huge habit of buying, lottery tickets because, according to him, he is going to win the millions and millions of dollars, and he's not going to have to actually work for a living. He needs a lot of funds so that he can live the lifestyle that he figures is appropriate to attract women to him. It's at this time also Mercury represents communication. So suddenly he starts having deep talks with his friend Addison, who must be embarrassed as hell these days because Elliot Roger outs this Addison character as being a fascist. He says the two of us would talk about things that would make normal people run for a country mile. So way to go, Addison. Congratulations. You must really be a stand-up guy. Okay, so now he overcomes his phobia of driving, begins to start, taking driving tests to get his license, which he flunks a couple of times, comes close to failing, finally gets his license, gets some mobility, and he begins these solitary walks in a vain hope that during these walks, some beautiful blonde is going to come up to him and say, hey, Elliot, word around town is that you're the greatest guy and that you're single. And so I figured that I would just walk around this neighborhood blindly hoping to run into you, so I could give you some action. That's exactly what he was hoping for. It's terrible. So he says, I continued going on walks around Mother's house in the desperate hope that I might possibly cross paths with some pretty girl who would be attracted to me. I'd have been satisfied with that. Sometimes I spent 2 or 3 hours wandering around the neighborhood. It was all I could do. So, this guy is now at this point on a downward spiral that is going to get worse and worse and worse. He drops out of Pierce Community College, which he attended for a time. He dropped out of several colleges because he dropped classes left and right. Because if there was a couple in that class, or if there was a pretty girl who didn't pay him any attention in that class, or if there was an attractive guy in there who was popular, this was unbearable to him. He could not learn in that environment. He would have to drop the class. He could not tolerate that.
Just dropped out. We talked in a couple of our shows about the nodes of the moon, Stephen, and I think that it's important to pick up on the nodal axis in Elliot's case, because we've explained to people the difference between the north node of the moon and the south node of the moon, and that the north node generally is something that brings energy into the chart or into a person's experience of life, and the south node, whilst it can have its benefits in certain cases, is generally where energy is released or there's a power outage. And I think it's very interesting to always look at the nodes in a person's chart when we're considering mental health. Yeah. And in Elliot's case, the the south node, which we generally consider to be more challenging, more malefic than the north node, it is not well aspected at all by the other planets. So that indicates a potential for him to be the cause of his own downfall, because that south node is known as the point of self-undoing, or it was by the ancients. And I know a lot of astrologers now, they dampen or tone down some of the ancient interpretations. So Mars is not really Saturn is not really the major malefic. Saturn can be wonderful. And we know that all of the archetypes they sit on a continuum, and they go from the very worst to the very best. But generally, we still have to remember that there are some very challenging points in a chart, and particularly when they're badly aspected, they become really amplified. So he's got that south node in Cancer, and when you look at the eclipse series before his birth, you see that south node is the exact point of a solar eclipse, a very powerful solar eclipse. Now, that also suggests that this guy is very likely to have significant problems in life. And then when you look at the rest of the chart to analyze his psyche, you see how it's most likely to unfold. Well, what frustrates me, Stephen, is that this information is available.
Yes.
So we can see these things, and these tools should be used, not in all cases, but in severe cases, such as a kid that goes on YouTube or films a video saying he's going to slaughter a bunch of people and puts it on YouTube, an alarm bell rings, and in these strange and severe cases, we should be using these metaphysical tools and saying, well, let's check him out metaphysically.
Sure.
What does a metaphysician have to say? What does a great astrologer have to say? Why can't we use these tools properly? They're so accurate. It drives me nuts.
I can, and I do all the time. And additionally, one other thing about the nodes is that the north node itself can be quite malefic at times. If any node, south or north, is in the 8th house, or in certain cases the 7th house, this can not only cause mental problems, it's quite lethal. The nodes can kill. I've seen cases in several presidents where if you time primary directions to the nodes or of the nodes, they die within days. So I've seen directions to the nodes. Now, I'm not saying if you have the node we're all going to die of something. What I'm saying is the nodes can actually be a fairly good predictive tool when it comes to understanding someone's lifespan. And, I'm doing all of this ex post facto, but it can also be used ex ante facto as well to understand things. Now, this isn't what killed Elliot. Elliot's nodes, I'm convinced, are not in the 8th and 2nd house axis. Elliot's, one of the things that Elliot lacks in his birth chart is something called a hilaj. This comes to us from the Arabs, sometimes a hale. And essentially what it is, it's a giver of life. The things that astrologers used to look at in the old days to determine whether or not a baby was going to survive to a certain age, whether or not it would survive long enough to take nourishment, whether it would be born at all, etc. Whether it would survive into puberty. And it's very hard to settle upon what could be the Hilaj Elliot Roger's chart. So he did not have much of a vital life force.
Well, one of the high legs in everyone's chart is the sun. So the luminaries, the sun and the moon, are always a high leg. And as we've said, his sun is it's very poor. So that's a problem from the get-go, particularly if we discover that his ascendant, the ruler of his physical body, is indeed Leo, because that would mean that another bringer of life, his ascendant, is kaput as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
I hope that we do discover his exact birth time, that comes into the public domain, because it will be very interesting to analyze Elliot's 3rd house of mentality, and to see, you can see a lot anyway, but it would be really interesting to look at that part of his chart and say, well, let's decipher the 3rd house in this case.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm definitely working on that the rectification of a chart to get a birth time is a very difficult and extensive process, and it's essentially retro engineering the birth time from the events that happen in a person's life. You know, the idea is if we can time precise events from a precise birth time, then we ought to be able to do the reverse. And in fact, we can. And indeed, a good number of the birth figures in Astro Databank, these are off. We've got a train coming. I don't know if you guys can hear that.
You have got a train. You have. You know, Stephen, I just ran a report on the eclipses, the eclipses that have occurred in the last 12 months or so, and I always find that they give an enormous amount of insight. They really show you how a theme is building, so we can look at progressions, we can look at all manner of things, but eclipses I find particularly revealing, and when you progress his chart to see where his moon is positioned, moon being, again, the impulses of the right hemisphere of the brain, the last eclipse, which was the 29th of April, solar eclipse in Taurus, it opposed the moon.
Oh, yeah. And it's very close. It's getting kind of close to our big date there, too, where he finally snapped and went crazy. Unfortunately, about the only good thing that came out of the Isla Vista event is that it was much... it was much smaller than he wanted it to be.
Yes,
you know.
Thank God.
Thank God. It was an immense tragedy.
Yeah, but thank God those girls didn't at the university didn't open the front door, because he was knocking on the door, ready to go in and slaughter some girls.
His plan was to slaughter all of them. He wanted to kill all of them. And what he wanted to do was he was going to spread this out over 3 days. The first day was phase 1. He would kill his roommates, and then he would invite people. He would start luring guys into his apartment to kill them, and he was going to torture them. He was going to really make them pay for their sin of being attractive, happy people. The second day would be the war against women, and that's when he was going to go to the Alpha Phi sorority house, go inside, and kill every last one of those poor young ladies. The third day would have been just a general rampage against humanity, where, you know, he was going to take his dad's Mercedes SUV and just start plastering people. And that was his plan. But the reality of it is pretty much evident of the difference between, you know, what Elliot thought of himself and the reality of Elliot's weak son. The whole event lasted about 10 minutes from the time 911 was called until the time Elliot Roger lay dead on the asphalt. 10 minutes.
Scary stuff. You know, again, we've spoken a lot in our shows about the Uranus-Pluto square, so that transiting square between Pluto currently in Capricorn and Uranus currently in Aries. So it's a challenging dynamic. And when you look at how that was moving through Elliot's world, psyche, soul, however you want to describe it, it activated his Neptune right on top of his part of fortune. Yeah. So that in itself was an alarm bell sounding. Yeah. And again, I just wish we could get our hands on these cases before they happen. I just wish we would get more inquiries. We do get them, but I wish we get more inquiries about individuals that are considered to be high risk, because we can see when they really will lose the plot. We can see when they really will take action. You know, people's lives could be saved.
I think it's a big question mark, and this is really a sort of a philosophical debate here. Would it have made a difference in Elliot Roger, or was he destined to do what he was going to do? Because I'll tell you one thing: nothing was going to get better for this guy. You know, once he ended.
Well, I didn't mean though. Oh, let's rescue Elliot, although he clearly needed help. I meant. Let's be clear. This guy is dangerous.
Yeah.
And about to lose the plot, about to pull the trigger, literally. And if we could reveal that information, that metaphysical insight, in advance of the person taking action, then lives could be saved.
Yes, and that would
not
be
his. I'm not being mean, but don't really care about his life. I care about the poor people, the innocent people he slaughtered.
So do I. And I mean, if you look at figure 15, we've got a bi-wheel set up there that has the transits for the time of his attack, juxtaposed against his natal chart, and we can see a very troubling aspect forming. You know, Mars is lining up to oppose his Uranus and Aries. You know, and interestingly enough, what I want people to realize is that the opposition between Mars and Aries was not exact. It didn't have to be exact for the event to happen. As Mars is approaching exactitude with his opposition with Uranus, it's happening. And this also involves a T-square with transiting Pluto that's conjunct Neptune as well. And also look at his natal Neptune, his natal Pluto. Look at transiting Saturn conjuncting that. It just conjuncted it, and it moved. You know, it was moving on. So we see from these dynamics that the aspects do not have to be exact. You see, but before the terrible things can happen, they can be just forming. You know, the conjunction with Saturn and Pluto would have happened sometime before the event and would have primed him for it. Now, I want to make clear also, Elliot had planned on doing this on the Halloween of the year of Halloween of 2013. The reason he didn't get to go through with it is because he got his leg broken by a couple of kids who hated his guts. He went to this party where there was this I got to give it to him. Towards the end, he did not want to. He was trying to find a way out. So he was desperately trying to integrate with people, but he just couldn't do it. He wanted to integrate people, but he wanted it to be a passive affair where people integrated him into their social environments. He did not want to make any effort integrating himself into the environment. He expected everyone to fall down on their knees and start worshiping him. So he goes to this party. He's like, okay, I'm going to give society one last shot. He goes to this party expecting people to stop what they're doing and say, oh my God, Elliot Roger is here. Call the paparazzi. And it didn't. When they didn't do that, he started trying to push the girls off of this 10-foot ledge. He failed. What happened was the boys there defending the girls, they pushed him off the ledge. He wound up shattering his leg, for which I'm extremely grateful. And I hope it hurt, the son of a bitch. I hope it hurt. And this put off the date for 6 months or so. He then rescheduled it for April, something like that, and got sick. Now, he did not want to have to kill his dad. He wanted to kill his stepmother. He planned on doing that gleefully. And he was also going to plan to kill his baby brother, Jazz, the same baby brother that he had saved from the pool years before. That same baby brother that he confessed to liking. Why? Because his baby brother was being successful. His baby brother, even at that tender age, this was the worst thing you could do to Elliot Roger, was to outperform him at a young...
Do well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you did it at an age younger than he, then that was even worse. And so he was going to kill his baby brother for that. Fortunately, he did not get the chance. Unfortunately, he didn't get a chance to harm Sumaya, his stepmother, the only person that I could tell who tried to, again, exert any kind of discipline. She tried sending him to her home country of Morocco. He hated it there. He considered it a backwater. And the worst part of all during his last trip there was that he wasn't allowed to fly first class. He loved... he loved nothing more than to skip across people like me and you who had to wait in line to get, fly economy. He loved to smirk at us when he would skip us going into first class. I mean, you know what? I was actually feeling sorry for the little shit stain up until then. But when I read that, I was like, oh my God, I'm glad I hate you you're terrible. You're terrible. Because, that's just the way Elliot Roger thought. Now, this is the problem. Because the only people he could function socially with were those who were at the bottom of the social heap. But the catch-22 was that he couldn't stand those people. They would never be the type that I would associate with. And yet they were the only kinds of people he could tolerate. You see. Now, the question comes up, what could Elliot have done with his life? What could he have done professionally? The kid... had exactly 2 jobs in his entire life. One was helping a neighbor build a staircase, and I can only imagine what that was like.
Crooked.
Yeah. The second job was a job that a counselor that his mother hired for him got. The counselor got this job for him. he lasted half a day at that job, and the only reason he lasted that long was because it took him that long to figure out how to, walk away from it, how to quit it. I guess he just couldn't walk off. But it was a custodial job, cleaning offices. This was this was well beneath Elliot Roger. He could not do that kind of work. So finding work for him that would be quote unquote appropriate would be difficult. Now, what kind of work would be appropriate for Elliot Roger? The kind of work where he'd be paid vast sums of money for not exerting himself and for just being his magnificent, beautiful self. In other words, nobody was going to pay him to do that. He was destined to fail at his goal of getting a lot of money to attract girls. And because of this, because he knew he was a loser, because he knew he was destined to fail at getting this money, he was shoehorned into the act of May the 23rd. He was shoehorned into that massacre. He saw no other way out. He knew that if he could not find a way to make millions of bucks, that's why he kept playing the lottery. He drove to Arizona to buy lottery tickets. It was his last shot. It was his last hope, and he actually believed he would win. He thought that was his destiny. He would go to bed at night before the lottery winnings were announced, confident, dreaming of his life as a gazillionaire. The next day, when he hit the reality and it's time to check to see if he won, often he could not check the results for 3 or 4 days, because he was scared. And indeed, not winning the lottery was a death sentence for Elliot.
Stephen, you said, how could this have unfolded? And I wanted to go back to what I mentioned before about the natal chart and seeing in his chart that Pluto, the great transformer, which was in it's modern planet of death as well, but it's under its own sign of Scorpio in his natal chart. And so anybody born around that time, around his age, would now be experiencing Pluto transiting over Neptune. Just in the last year or so will have moved over Uranus, and now it's moving over Neptune. So these are quite challenging transformational dynamics for people, and I'm not saying that everybody is experiencing what Elliot Roger was experiencing or vice versa, because every case is extremely different, and that's reflected by the uniqueness of a full natal chart. But those slow movers, Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, they are programmed in effect to cause really quite significant transformations, some pretty significant challenges or obstacles that people have to overcome at let's face it, what is a pretty early age. Do you see where I'm going? What I mean by that?
Absolutely, I do. And we specify, we render specific the effects of the outer planets via their house placement. And unfortunately, right now, a definitive house arrangement it eludes us right now. No astrologer has that quite yet.
So it's going to affect everybody in the context of their individual psyche, their chart, the different areas of life reflected by the flow of the houses, determined by the time of birth, etc. And it is complex. But I think that another example of that, Pluto transiting over these challenging planets, Uranus and Neptune, for all people born around that time, is the disillusionment, the sudden awakening around structures and order in life and career, ambition, materialism. So to me, it really perfectly describes the dynamic of so many people that are completing their education, their higher education, that they've invested time, they've invested money, they've probably got big student loans, and lo and behold, the equation's not really working out the way it did in the past for their parents or their older siblings. And it reflects some of those challenging dynamics that the way of the world it's no longer what it used to be.
Right, especially for someone like Elliot Roger, this would have been this could have had a shattering effect on the personality. He resented, really, he felt terrible. He hated it when his parents divorced, and his mother eventually had to downgrade into a house in a neighborhood that he considered to be beneath him. He hated this. And then she eventually moved into, God forbid, an apartment, and his life really hit a low then. But the good thing about the apartment was that his mom, to compensate, got him some high-speed internet, and so he could fully devote his life to playing video games. And he says in his autobiography that his social life ended on that day. Well,
I think, again, the polarization between Leo, the pride of Leo, and Capricorn, the materialism and status of Capricorn, in the chart of somebody that's clearly so unhealthy psychologically, it did exactly what you would predict astrologically. It caused a very unhealthy relationship with issues around pride, self, ego, and materialism, structure, status in the world.
Oh yeah, and that's one reason I love the Fyrdaria so much, is because the Fyrdaria, the planetary sequence, such as figure 16, figure 17, they actually take all of these planetary symbols we're talking about and construct a narrative out of them. That's indeed what gives them their predictive power. They construct a story, you see. And now we're approaching the end here for Elliot, and the story is told quite succinctly by the Fyrdaria. By now we're in the Mercury planetary period, you see, and a lot of things are changing for Elliot. Mercury is all about discovery. So Elliot discovers this movie. I can't remember the name of it. The name is actually irrelevant. It was a B film, but the movie actually had a very profound effect on him. Because, and I quote, this is from page 77 in his autobiography, "The movie depicted lots of good-looking young people enjoying pleasurable sex lives. I thought about it for many months afterward, and I constantly read the story online. I found out that it took place in Santa Barbara, which prompted me to read about college life in Santa Barbara. I found out about Isla Vista, the small town adjacent to UCSB where all of the college students live and have parties." This is significant. This is vital. The event in Isla Vista could not have happened had he not known about Isla Vista. No? And this happens during the Mercury Fyrdar. Now, it's not all fatalistic. The Mercury as chronocrator, as the time lord of that period, offers him a way out. It's at this time that his mother, and I'll quote, better yet, I'll quote from page 69. "My mother one day told me I should become a writer because I had some talent in writing." And by the way, I fully agree. The young man was quite bright, and he could write very well. And continuing with the quote, "That was strange to hear. For my whole life, I was never talented at anything I tried." Elliot was quite a talented author. Had he taken a different course, he could have given society many good works of literature. But the problem is that Elliot's pressing problem is that writing would require discipline and work, and he might be mature before he realized any finances from it. And he needed immense finances right now, so he gave that up. He turned his back on it. That, writing an epic novel was no longer an option for him. So now we enter into the moon phase of Mercury's Fyrdar. Okay, now the lunar period, the moon period of that Fyrdaria would have started on the 2nd of June in 2011. Okay, and moon is about change. The moon changes. It goes through 4 phases. The moon changes. It's famous for change. Okay, he enters the moon sub-Fyrdar on the 2nd of June, and then he changes location to the Capri Apartments in Isla Vista on the 4th of June. This is how potent the Fyrdaria are. Elliot Roger even himself sensed this change in Fyrdar very naturally as he writes when this Fyrdar hits, and so ends another era of my extraordinary and tragic life. This is from page 82. So even though Elliot has no knowledge of astrology, something inside of him understands that he's entered into a new planetary period somehow. He refers to this as the end game, which indeed it was. He would only survive to enter into one more planetary sub-period, and that's the period of Saturn. Quite appropriately.
So I wrote a blog about it, and I got some interesting reactions. I got a lot of people saying that they loved my blog, and then I got one people saying that they thought I was insensitive, and another person mentioning issues about guns and regulations associated with guns. I'm not against people having guns. What I'm against is mental people being able to get their hands on guns. That's the problem that we've got. It's not that there are too many guns out there. It's that they're able to get into hands of people that are mentally ill
Yeah.
This guy was just bound to snap at some point. Stephen, did you look at the declinations? Because when I was preparing, I noticed that his moon was at extreme declination. And I wanted to remind our listeners, particularly those that are interested in learning more about astrology, I wanted to remind them that when a planet goes to extreme declination, it almost starts to lose control of itself. And his moon at the time of birth was at minus 24.5 degrees, so that's considered extreme declination, and we would consider it to start losing control. So he's got a bizarre profile anyway, but that added salt to the wound. But not only that, Uranus, real slow mover, that would very rarely reach extreme declination. Yeah. Was also at extreme declination, and the moon, which is pretty fast moving, had notched its way up there, and they were both there together. So what you got was bizarre impulses and completely irrational reactions from this kid. So he was bound to snap at some point. It was just a question of time. Yeah. But I want to ask you about, I know that you and I have slightly different views on gun control. Right. So I come from the UK, and we don't have guns. It's pretty rare for a person to have a gun. You might have a gun if you're a farmer, or if you have a hunting license, although that's becoming rare as well. Even the police don't carry guns. There are armed response units that can be called out if it's required. And I understand the US. I'm learning more and more about it. I don't claim to know everything, but I know that as part of the Constitution, people are entitled to have a gun, and I don't have a problem with that at all. I respect that. I think it's part of the culture and it's part of the Constitution. But how do we not control guns completely? But how do we control the situation so that people that are mentally ill, like James Holmes, Adam Lanza, Elliot Rogers, how could we do to stop them from ordering rounds and rounds of ammo on the internet like James Holmes did?
I don't know that it's possible, frankly, and I'll tell you why. First of all, Elliot Roger, I would argue he's absolutely not insane at all. He has a personality disorder for sure, but as far as clinical and if you look, for example, at let's see, what figure is it? If you look at example for figure 13, here we have the chart of Jared Loeffner. This is the chart of someone insane. Jared Loeffner was the Tucson assailant of the Congresswoman, Congresswoman Giffords. This is the chart of a schizophrenic you're looking at, figure 13. Elliot Roger was certainly not a schizophrenic. Now, the thing is, many, if not a lot of Elliot's casualties were struck by his car. You see, when someone like Elliot Roger decides to rampage, they definitely don't need weapons. Now, Launer
was born under a South Node eclipse, which is, he was born. Yeah, exactly under an eclipse.
Not only that, but it's
particularly challenging. But where I don't agree with you is that I don't. When I look at the chart of Elliot Roger, and when I think of his behavior in his video, I'm pretty clear that, and then I read about what he did, I'm pretty clear that the kid was barking mad. They're obviously very different types of mental illness, and it's extremely complex. And I know that it's extremely difficult for psychiatrists to diagnose a mental illness, to get to the root of the problem. And I think that's why there's so much experimentation, really, with psychiatric drugs, Stephen. So I've seen cases in which a psychiatrist prescribes a drug or two or three or four, and the poor patient has to see what their reaction is to those drugs. Does it help? Does it make them worse? Does one need to be switched out for another? And a lot of these drugs I don't think are properly tested. And going back to this chap's chart, not Launer, but Elliot Roger, when you look at Neptune, the planet that rules drugs, pharmaceuticals, it is at the north node, and therefore it opposes the south node, and it is involved by aspects to Pluto in Scorpio. I would be very interested to learn when the information is available whether this kid was on psychiatric meds and how many he was taking, and that I think will answer more of the puzzle, because this is a chart that says to me it's very likely that he was medicated. You saw it in have you heard of Peaches Geldof, Bob Geldof's daughter?
I have not.
Well, Peaches Geldof was a beautiful girl. Her mother died tragically because of an involvement with drugs, and she committed suicide, or didn't commit suicide. She was doing drugs. We don't know whether she intended to go or it was accidental, but when you looked at the chart, and I used it in one of my classes online and showed my students that clearly there were drugs involved. You could see it. The chart says drugs involved in this person's death, and sure enough, a couple of weeks later, it came out that she had been doing drugs. Drugs were found in her system, and I mean recreational drugs. But it'd be very interesting to see what this guy Elliot Rogers was taking.
Right.
I mean, do you feel, looking at this chart, that this is the chart of somebody that's medicated?
Actually, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one, my friend. Okay. I would actually predict that if there's an autopsy, and I'm assuming there probably will be one, that if the toxicology report, it wouldn't surprise me if there were acute levels of dope in his system, just to sort of buck him up and give him the bravery to go through with it. But as far as evidence of chronic medication taking, I would be very surprised if there's evidence of that.
But so you don't think that
I do not.
was taking any psychiatric meds?
I absolutely do not think that. Elliot Roger would have been way too proud to have taken those medications. Absolutely, he would not.
Well, it will be interesting to find out.
It will.
Because, again, nearly all of the mass murder cases in the last 20, 25 years were taking or withdrawing from psychiatric meds.
First of all, it's my opinion. Now, I'm definitely not a psychiatrist. I'm not a pathologist. As much as I would like to, I'm not the one performing the autopsy. But I would also be surprised if they find evidence of organic brain disease. I do not think that Elliot Roger had any organic mental pathology. I think that his disturbances were of the personality. And I don't think the guy was insane. I think he was extraordinarily culpable in what he did. I don't think he was insane at all.
Well, actually, on the meds front, it looks like we're both right.
Oh, really?
because I just saw something. I was just glancing on Google. We'll have to do some more research after the show. But he did refuse to take some psychiatric meds that were prescribed for extreme paranoia.
Right.
But he was taking Xanax for days before he did what he did. And you see, I think that so we're both right. You said he would have refused, and he did, but he was taking Xanax. But that wasn't prescribed probably as part of a solution for him. But I think that my point here is, when a person has psychiatric illness, the meds can be a solution, but they can also, I think, provoke almost a crystallization, a crisis,
right.
an accumulation of energies that can cause that person to completely lose the plot, which is the exact opposite of what they're supposed to be doing.
I don't know if Elliot Roger even had a plot to lose to begin with. This guy is a completely inadequate personality. He was from day one. And, I actually speculated that it wouldn't surprise me at all if they found acute levels of medication in his bloodstream. Acute meaning, recently taken just to buck himself up, just to help him get through the act itself. But there's not going to be evidence of long-term medication taking. And in fact, he should have been. If he had been on some sort of a treatment regimen, some sort of medicines, then I don't think the Isla Vista episode would have happened at all. I think he needed to be medicated, but he was just too proud to take the stuff. That's
apparently he did suffer. It says that he did suffer from extreme paranoia, that he did hear voices. He'd been seeing a mental health professional for years. His team, his family, his parents had got a team of doctors involved. Sadly, his parents are now in hiding.
I don't blame them. They have to be the most hated people in America. Mr. Roger, I think he really tried, but I think he was too wrapped up in his career. He's symbolized in Elliot's chart by the retrograde Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn in Aquarius, that's a very dignified Saturn, and Mr. Roger is a highly talented man with a lot of technical skills. But the retrogradation, the retrograde state of Saturn, it makes him weak. A retrograde planet like that is one that signifies events that repeatedly happen that are still of the nature of Saturn. So, and also if we're correct about this tentative birth time of 6:30 or so in the morning, then we have a cadent Saturn as well, which is the signature that we see in a lot of miscreants' charts, because Saturn as a symbol of fatherhood is often very weak in these people's charts because they don't have that fatherhood that they really need. And Elliot totally lacked that. He had a weak father figure. His life was dominated by two mother figures, one whom he hated and the other one who spoiled him thoroughly. I mean, Elliot wouldn't even tell, and the way he says it in his autobiography, he does not, simply tell. He doesn't ask his mom for things. He tells her what to get, and she gets it. She supplies it. My mom certainly didn't do that to me. Now, this might not be so bad if we're talking about video games. Mom, I need World of Warcraft, the Super Nerd expansion. Fine, it's natural for mom to get that for their kid. But mom spoiled Elliot in a worse way. When Elliot couldn't integrate himself into the society of high school, middle school, and college, etc., instead of mom and dad forcing him to go through it, forcing him to suck it up and be a man for Christ's sake and to do something, defend himself, they're like, okay, son, we're going to empower you to run from this. I
know, Stephen, but what I want to, and I know you and I have differed a little bit on our views around the parents, and I think that came up when we talked about Dharma.
Right.
And I don't know this guy's parents. I haven't read much about his parents. I know that every parent on the planet has made good decisions and bad decisions, and I know that his natal chart shows me that this is a guy that had severe issues. And yes, I'm sure that his parents made some bad decisions on occasions, but all parents do. And I want to reiterate that I look at this guy's chart and think, well, even if he'd had what someone might consider to be the perfect parental guidance, if that exists, he still would have had problems. This guy has a very, very challenging chart.
Yeah, he would have had problems, and they would have just gotten worse. But, the fact remains, I've read his autobiography. I know, and you have to be fair. I'm reading about his parents from his perspective. I don't have his mom sitting there talking to me, defending herself. I don't have his father.
I know, but
however,
Stephen, you watch his video again. This is not a guy that sees things clearly. So I'm not defending the parents and saying that there's no blame or they were perfect.
Right.
But again, I listen back to, or I think back to the video of his, the one when he was sitting in his car, and I wouldn't really pay much heed to anything he says. So it is very interesting to read his autobiography to try and understand what the hell was going on with him. But and I'm sure some of it's valid. But I feel for the parents, Steve, and I always do in these cases because how must they feel? I can't even begin to imagine how they must feel. I don't think that any parent deserves to experience what they must be experiencing right now.
I totally do. We have 7 billion people on this planet, and if you are going to bring a child onto this earth and then going to prioritize your career over that child, yeah, that's a problem. Elliot Roger gave his parents red flag after red flag after red flag after red flag, and they couldn't be bothered to troubleshoot this problem in a definitive way. Now, they may have screwed up.
Well, you say that, Stephen, but you don't know the ins and outs of exactly what they've done. This guy probably didn't write in his autobiography that what his parents did do to help him. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I think that there are many different angles, and unless I watched his whole childhood on a webcam, and saw exactly what his parents did, I don't feel in a position to throw all the blame at their door. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, that's
and I think
fine.
it's great that you and I disagree, because it's an interesting part of our show. We don't just sit here always agreeing with each other.
That's fine. I mean, my message to parents right now is this, and I'm not going to waver from this. If you create a life and then you don't tend to that life that you've created, you bear culpability in what's happened. And I say the proof is in the pudding. Now, I'm not saying that we should call up the governor and have Mr. Rodger, committed into the sexual offenders wing of the adult correctional facility. You know what I'm saying? The culpability is spread, maybe throughout all society. And if certainly Elliot Roger shares the lion's share of the blame, but I can't escape the notion that his parents are the ones who knew him better than anyone else. And Mom belatedly tried to put a stop to it. She called the law on the little shit. She called the law on him. And, the law dropped the ball, too. But it's not the police's position to raise your children for you. Dad was too busy filming his documentaries, going to Europe. And, what I want to press upon you is that there's a way to extract the truth from liars based upon what they tell. I'm not an expert at it, but detectives do it all the time. And I'll also say this. Elliot's autobiography is shockingly honest. You read it. I've read it. You try to read it.
You certainly have intrigued me to read it.
I'll share a copy of it with you. You'll be shocked at its honesty. Yeah,
and I would like to read it for sure, because I think it will certainly be very interesting. I wanted to ask you, ask your input as well on the psychiatric system, or the support available for people that have mental health issues in the US, because when I left the UK, Stephen, I was coming to my American dream, and I love living in the US. There are so many things about the US that are wonderful. I've met so many incredibly interesting and talented people here, and I like living here. It's a great place to be. When I left the UK, one of my criticisms of the UK was the poor healthcare system. So it's a state healthcare system. There is private healthcare as well, and if you've got a good job, generally you get private healthcare as well. But there is some healthcare or healthcare available to everybody, and I don't want to get into the whole healthcare debate. But when I came to the US, and I met people that clients that maybe were having emotional difficulties or going through a crisis in life, or people that were suicidal and were told, it's a 3-month waiting list for an appointment with a psychologist with health care. I was just staggered. So I think that a really important part of the whole debate here about gun control and about the level of gun control that we should or shouldn't have in the US, but the debate about these mass murders that are, they're not even rare now. This is happening all the time. A big part of the debate's got to be about psychiatry.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen people who were clearly homicidal released because their insurance would only pay for a couple of days.
Yeah, if you left Britain thinking that the United Kingdom's healthcare system was primitive, and if you were expecting an improvement on that in America, I can imagine you're shocked. No, the psychiatric attention that Rodger received was woefully inadequate. Woefully inadequate. And I'm a buck stops here kind of guy. You know what I mean? I am the buck stops here. So there is responsibility to be shared, both as a society and all that good stuff. So the psychiatrist, who knows if they could have impacted this guy? All I know is that when the times that he went to go see them, a lot of times moments were wasted. Half of the session would be wasted as the psychiatrist would argue with mom and dad over some administrative or bureaucratic deal. And by the time the psychiatrist got to Elliot, I don't know if the psychiatrist understood the personality structure inside Elliot's head. I do, simply because I have access, and all of us do now, to his autobiography. The psychiatrist presumably would not have had access to that. So, hindsight is 20/20. And knowing what we know now about Elliot Roger, the psychiatrist would have had to have understood Elliot's extreme phobia of his extreme social anxiety due to all the happiness that he encountered there. This guy was like the Grinch on steroids. You see, I don't think the psychiatrist perceived just how hateful, just how odious happiness was to Elliot Roger. If he did, but the modern psychiatry's impulse is to reach for the prescription pad. The first thing that is going to happen to you when you go see a therapist is that he's going to, and this is where I'm convinced astrologers are superior to therapists. The therapist is first going to try to pigeonhole you into a category by giving you an exam, a template exam, like for a battery. He's going to ask you a couple hundred questions. And based upon your answers to those questions, you're going to be shoehorned into this or that category. This sort of approach, woefully inadequate with a personality such as Elliot Roger. Can't happen.
Well, this is again, Stephen, why we need to get creative. And I think in law enforcement, crime prevention, the prevention of great tragedy, that these tools, these metaphysical tools, well understood, well practiced, are invaluable.
I tell you, I agree. I would love to work in tandem with law enforcement. They're doing it anyway. The criminal profilers in Quantico have fewer tools available to them than the astrologers.
They'd be blown away if we could go there for the weekend.
Let me tell you something.
Look at some of the charts. They'd be blown away by what we could show them. What
the criminal profiler at Quantico is doing is actually less based on empirical evidence than what you and I are doing, by analyzing natal charts. But I just want to make this point. We could render guns illegal all we want to, but what's stopping an Elliot Roger from, poisoning a water supply or
buying a knife,
buying a knife, or tampering with medications and slipping poisons? I mean, we had that problem in America during the 80s, where that's why when you buy anything, it's tamper proof, because several people died because somebody was slipping poisons into publicly available goods such as medicines and things like that. We need to stop focusing on taking away methods to kill people and start focusing on
why they're doing it. Yeah,
right. What kind of society produced an Elliot Roger? In other words, we need to realize that the bullies are simply playing at being grown up. They learned their bullying from something. They learned it from the social hierarchies that we've constructed for them. And what they've learned from us, the adults, is that in order to climb on that social hierarchy, you're going to have to do it at someone else's expense. This is the message we're teaching our children, and we seem so disgusted when acts of bullying happen. We seem so disgusted when rampages and massacres happen. But if the buck stops at Mr. Rogers' door and Elliot Rogers' mom's door, and if the buck stops at his psychiatrist's door and the cop's door, it also stops at my door, and it stops at your door too, Steve, and it stops at the door of everyone listening to this broadcast.
Oh, it absolutely does. And we're all, for example, we all have a voice. We can all express our opinion. We can all write to our representatives. We all have a vote. We can all raise this higher on the agenda. And I don't just mean gun control. I mean this problem with rampage killings in the United States, and it does happen in other countries. I was in the UK at the time of the Hungerford massacre. That was dreadful. We had the dreadful. I mean, it doesn't just happen here in the US, but it happens so frequently here. Well, and we do have a voice. We are able to speak up. We are able to say what we want. It's not a perfect system, but we are accountable.
Right.
We can together say that we want change.
I think one of the reasons these things happen is because there isn't, believe it or not, there's an archetype for this sort of thing. Now, mass murder is not, something new, but it has become a cultural phenomenon starting in the 50s with the Whitman massacre at the University of Texas. This guy, in other words, there's a forebearer, a precursor to this sort of thing, and it brought up the idea to modern mass culture, big societies like this. It gave us the idea that, hey, we can snap. We can go crazy. And so now we're actually feeding into the archetype, by sort of, believe it or not, glorifying it in a half-assed way. Now, America's going to have more rampage massacres than other countries because America's a big country. I mean, I'm not a statistician or anything. I don't know how the numbers play out in comparison to other countries, but probably one of the bloodiest and it wasn't a massacre, it wasn't a mass murder, but probably one of the bloodiest and most disgusting acts of public violence actually occurred in your country, or your home country, I should say, England, with the guy who hacked that British soldier to death right there in the streets. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah,
or if you've seen that. You know, pretty disgusting act.
And then the doctor who had killed 100 plus women. So it doesn't just happen in the US. It's not a problem that is unique to the United States, but the frequency of it in the United States is
pretty high.
Shocking.
It is shocking, and you know, you're exactly right. We don't really know what to do with our mentally ill people. We don't know what to do with them, and some slip through the cracks. Jared Loughner, the Tucson shooter, he slipped through the cracks. That guy, he did have organic brain illness. He had schizophrenia. Elliot Roger, his disorders were a little bit more subtle than that. Now, I mean, in other words, Jared Loughner, the Tucson shooter,
he was hearing voices. I mean, it was on record that he heard voices. That is a sign of schizophrenia. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think it will be very interesting to find out more about his mental problems from psychiatrists. And I'm
telling you, man, that autobiography I read was too lucid to be the product of an insane person. I promise you that. I'll have a hard time believing.
You need to send me a copy of it to read this weekend.
I will. It's way too lucid for him to have been any kind of. For example, if Jared Loughner, the Tucson shooter, had penned that manifesto, it would have been disjointed. You know, it would have been incomprehensible. It would have been. I mean, Jared Loughner, in other words, by the time he reached a certain age, you had a different Jared Loughner. You know what I mean? I mean, radically different Jared Loughner. With Elliot Roger, it was not so. It
would be very interesting if someday his parents wrote about him and about his childhood. It would be really, really interesting to hear their perspective.
They're going to try to forget about him as quickly as possible. You know, already he was a problem for his mom because, you know, even though she spoiled him, he was a pain in the ass. She wanted him out of out of her house because he threw tantrums all the time for things. Her daughter, his sister, Georgiana, she got a boyfriend. Okay, and this was intolerable to Elliot Roger. He hated the guy. And all of a sudden, his sister, and he hated his sister. You know, and all of a sudden, his sister was one of the happy people. You know, one of the blessed, beautiful people, and for that he hated her, and he wanted his mother to hate his sister's boyfriend, and he could not forgive her for that because she would not hate his sister. I mean, so this is the kind of person we're dealing with Elliot Roger. You know, insane? Nah, I don't think so. Severe problems with the personality? Definitely. They're very raw, vulnerable, easily inflamed ego. The sort of ego that interprets everything in terms of himself. I mean, he's the kind of. I mean, right when you feel sorry for the guy, he does or he says something that makes you want to hurt him. It makes you want to hate him, such as his feeling of superiority and entitlement. Now, I'm going to tell you this right now. Despite all of our verbiage about, you know, maybe we could have done this for him, or maybe we could have stopped this. Or, you know, I kind of think that his case is, rather radical. I think with looking at his chart, I think it would have been really difficult for him to have gotten a good result out of life because I can tell easily looking from figure 16, the diurnal day sequence of planetary, things were going to just get terrible. Things were going to get a heck of a lot worse for Elliot Gould.
Yeah, I agree.
Elliot Roger, I knew I was going to do it.
There we go. Well, I think, again, let's talk about him again for 10, 15 minutes in a future show if his exact time of birth does become available, because it would be interesting to follow up. But talking about crazy people, we agreed, I think, that next week we would talk about North Korea. We'd also talk about South Korea, but the Koreas.
Yes. I'm interested in the Koreas because, to me, they actually remind me a lot of Elliot Roger, if you ask me. North Korea does, in the sense of being totally deluded, in the sense of thinking that their excrement does not bear an odor, in the sense of... Now, I'm not talking about the North Korean as a people. I'm talking about, obviously, the...
leadership.
Thank you. Also, they're very, well, what should I say? They have the potential to be quite violent for the rest of the world. And so, yeah, let's talk about North Korea next week. I like it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Well, are we going to talk about just North Korea or the dynamic between North and South Korea? I think it would be interesting. Well, let's say we focus primarily on the North Korean regime, but we can also maybe run a bit of synastry and compare the dynamics between the two countries.
Absolutely.
In the second half of the show.
I think it would be impossible to separate these two. I think they exist very much in an opposition type of relationship. I think they're inseparable. The ethnic character of that land mass is the same. There's no ethnic difference as far as I'm concerned between North Koreans and South Koreans. There's no real cultural difference. North Korea as a legal personality is very new. I don't think it's been around enough to completely nullify the extremely long Korean cultural cohesion that's existed, throughout the majority of history. And so,
well, I think when it comes to a genetic perspective, you think about the DNA of people, then yeah, I would agree. But vastly different ways of living now, and a child or even a 20-year-old, 25-year-old in North Korea at this point in time, that their experience of life is completely different from their counterpart in South Korea. So it's going to be very interesting to see. Maybe we can look at it from a generational perspective as well, because Mercury rules kids, young people. Be interested to see how the condition of Mercury in the North Korean chart compares with Mercury in the South Korean chart, as well as everything else. Interesting subject for sure.
Yeah, there are some minor differences that they appear minor on the surface, but in actual interpretation of the charts, they're as different as night and day. And I'm, as an example, if you compare the position of Uranus in the South Korean versus the North Korean chart, we'd see that Uranus is at the end of Gemini, and so in one chart it's in 29th degree of Gemini, which is a troubling spot. And then, in the next chart, they're in the beginning degrees. That's because they were founded around the same time.
As you and I identified the other day, that spot will be triggered at the same time.
Yeah, I want to point out to folks that, the endings of signs and the beginnings of the next signs are always rather tricky spots in the zodiac. 9 times out of 10, just to remind you guys of what we talked about at the beginning of the show, we discussed a bit about the terms or the bounds of the signs, which are, 5 to 6 degrees. They change. They're unequal lengths of subdivisions of the signs, and they have a profound effect on interpretation that most people just skip right over. At any rate, these bounds at the ends of the signs are always given to the malefics. So that's why the ending degrees of signs are quite difficult, because whatever planetary points in there is about to transition to a new way of being, a new way of expressing. It's about to get a different substance. You know what I mean? So Uranus is about to change, in the Korean charts, it's going to change from the substance of Gemini, and it's going to start receiving the substance of Cancer, which is a completely different energy altogether. So it'll be interesting to chat about that, for sure.
It's going to be an interesting show for sure.
I'm going to enjoy it.
Definitely. That's one that I've really been looking forward to, and we'll have a lot of fun with it. Also, it'll be very interesting at some point to look out into the future and consider how things will unfold for North Korea, particularly, and how that might or would impact South Korea and potentially the rest of the world. It'll be a good show.
Yes, it will. We should be paying very close attention to what happens in South Korea, because whatever happens to them, more than likely, is going to happen to us as well. Because, we're going to, they're our diplomatic partners. So unfortunately, it's a marriage, and, we'll see how it goes. But that's going to be next week, ladies and gentlemen. And, Steve, if you don't have anything else to add, I think we should just extend our condolences and our prayers to all of the victims and all of the people impacted by the Isla Vista shooting. And I want to make it clear that I'm also extending my condolences and my prayers to Mr. Rogers and Elliot's mom. Even though I sort of judged them rather harshly, they still lost a son, and I feel for them for that. The mistake has already been made. They had their chance. we all had our chance, and it's over with now. And all we can do is just pray and move on. Do you have anything you'd like to say, Steve, before we adjourn?
Just that I hope that we all continue to reflect and continue to think about our individual responsibilities in driving the change that we want to see,
right,
and how we can identify ways to stop this kind of tragedy. Enough is enough.
Well, I would like to let everybody know that Steve has actually written a very, very interesting article, a blog on Elliot Roger. You can find that at stephenframpton.com. I highly encourage everyone to visit and read that. I've read it, and I find it to be very interesting. Also, stephenframpton.com is a great place to interact with Steve. Drop him a message, read his other writings, and more importantly, pick up if you found this interesting, you'll definitely find his book, Thinking Completely Outside the Box, interesting, because in it he talks about the Aurora theater shooting and the astrological dynamics of James Egan Holmes. I've read it, and I've found it to be absolutely wonderful. Also, that book actually contains a short primer section that will catch you up to speed on a lot of the ways that Stephen and I do astrology. So it's a great read. You can find me at thegingerpsychic.com. My name is Stephen Lewis. Please drop by. I'd love to hear from you. I got a lot of articles up there that will hopefully give you some startling new ways to think about tarot and astrology, because I'm also a tarot reader. We've been threatening about getting tarot on this show at some point. We're going to have to get serious about that, aren't we, Steve?
We will have to, yeah. It's a fascinating tool.
Well,
fascinating tool that doesn't have the best reputation, and we need to correct that.
It does not have the best reputation, and maybe it's because there's such a disparity in the way that it's done. Tarot it relies on occult laws, just like astrology does, and the way that I do tarot, it has a very nice internal consistency with the way that I do astrology. So the tarot is the silver key, astrology the golden key. They're to be used in tandem. I consistently use them to verify results one of the other. And so, tarot is very important to me.
I like to look at the astrology first, and then I use tarot. But I find them extremely powerful when used in combination, as you said.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, that's the best way to use them, because, if I get a certain result looking at a horary astrological figure, for example, a horary figure, y'all, is one in which I ask a question and then cast a chart for my time and location that I come up with that question. Is John Smith going to win $1 million? What do I need to do to get that girl's attention? Is Kevin going to marry Janet, etc.? And then I cast a chart for that question. And if I'm confused about the results, I'll verify them with the tarot. If these results are congruent, I'm highly confident about the testimony that I received then. So it's an interesting thing to do. But I really appreciate everyone coming to listen to the show. I encourage you to send your questions to either myself, Stephen at thegingerpsychic.com, or my colleague Stephen Frampton, and that's inquiries at stephenframpton.com. And that's all I got. You have anything else you want to add, Steve?
No, again, just loving thoughts and prayers for everybody affected, and let's try and find ways to avoid these tragedies.
We will. We'll make that a focus of some of our future shows. We'll actually try to devise actual practical ways of perhaps avoiding things like this in the future. The thing is, with these sorts of things, you want to avoid a Minority Report type of deal. You know what I mean? That Philip K. Dick novel where, you could tell someone's going to commit a crime before he does it, and then you go bust them. There are constitutional issues with that sort of thing. So we could spend a lot of time speculating on possible solutions, and it'll be fun to do. So we'll definitely be getting into that. Please join us next week for our talk about North Korea. And keep an eye on Metaphysical Media Group. We are going to be talking about current events. We're going to be talking about criminology, investigations, unsolved cases, cold cases, hot cases, any kind of case you can think about. You're going to find it right here, Metaphysical Media Group. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you all next week. Have a great week.